Yesterday afternoon, I walked into the Callaway's nursery store that's nearest to me. I needed to pick up a thing or two. And I wasn't busy at all. There were 3 employees at the front. I was greeted warmly by them. And I said to them, "I assume you're all sold out of toilet paper." They acknowledged that they were. And then I said, "Well, what about pre-emergent weed killer? Has there been a run on pre-emergent weed killer?" We can cue that laugh track now that we talked about, Jordan. Let me just tell you, I'm just kind of doing this as my civic duty. I know that there are a lot of shortages in Plano, but if you need pre-emergent weed killer, the shelves are full of pre-emergent weed killer, so you don't need to be panicked about that. On a serious note, I think it is important for us to maintain a sense of humor even in the darkest of times. And then also on a serious note, I do want to encourage the members of the Christ United community to think about this not as a me moment, but as a we moment. The truth of the matter is that we will not get through this well as a community, as a family, as a community, as a nation, or really as a global community unless we do it together, and it's really important. So I want to encourage the members of Christ United that when you get into the store, if you don't have 14 days supply of toilet paper, you can get some, then get 14 days supply. If you can find a 14-day supply of hand sanitizer, that's appropriate. But we don't need more than 14 days, and the supplies will be catching back up. And that's a way of taking care of ourselves, which we should clearly do. But it's also thinking about other members of our community, some of whom don't have as much as we do. They don't have the transportation or the resources. And this is the best way in which we, as a Christian community, will get through this. Years ago, I heard Al Pacino make an acceptance speech. It was I think it was the Golden Globes, where he received a Lifetime Achievement Award. And I'll never forget what he said. I wrote it down, and I've kept it all these years. He said, "When I was 12 years old, my teacher told me to take the Psalms and go into the theater and read the Psalms in an empty theater. And so," he said, "I got a taste early on of the power of the Word." What a powerful statement that is, I think. The power of the Word. Preachers automatically get that, I think, but we're talking about the Word that comes to us in music and the Word that comes to us in the liturgy, and frankly, the Word that is present in the life of the community, the presence of Christ, the power of the Word. So thank you for joining us today to celebrate the power of the Word, and we're going to do so by reading one of those Psalms that he referred to, Psalm 95. The psalmist says, "Oh, come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation." You'll see that this psalm starts out as a kind of a traditional psalm of praise. "Let us come into his presence with thanksgiving. Let us make a joyful noise to him with songs of praise. For the Lord is a great God and a great King above all gods. In his hand are the depths of the earth. The heights of the mountains are his as well. The sea is his, for he made it, and the dry land which his hands have formed. Oh, come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, and the sheep of his hand." And then there's a switch in this psalm. And if you think about this, the Psalms were the songbook of the Hebrews. And so think about a worship leader leading us in the Psalms, and then he says, "Now wait." And he turns to the congregation and he says, "Now we're going to speak on behalf of God. This is what we hear God saying to us." It is a stern word of warning about the failure of the Hebrew people when they were in the wilderness. "Oh, that today you would listen to his voice." And here's his voice. "Do not harden your hearts as at Meribah and as on the day at Massah in the wilderness." Meribah and Massah referred to 2 stories about the journey through the wilderness. One's found in Exodus, the other is found in Numbers. These 2 stories both refer to the doubt and the panic that the people experienced when they thought they could not find water, and how they rebelled against Moses and Aaron, and ultimately rebelled against God by not trusting God. So this is a dark, dark moment in the life of the Hebrews that the song leader and the psalmist is reminding them of and reminding us of. So remember at Meribah and on the day of Massah in the wilderness, when your ancestors tested me and put me to the proof, though they had already seen my great works. For 40 years I loathed that generation, and I said, they are a people whose hearts go astray, and they do not regard my ways. Therefore, in my anger, I swore, they shall not enter my rest, or they shall not enter the rest that will be found in the promised land. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Over 2 decades ago, I was in a rather serious automobile accident. I remember it clearly. We were at the church over in Glencliff at the time, so it's been at least 20 years ago. I was on Central Expressway. It was a day like we're experiencing today in North Texas. It was a rainy and dark day. It wasn't pouring rain, but it was raining enough. The Central Expressway, the roads were slick, and I was being especially careful for that reason. I don't think I was driving more than 45 or 50 miles an hour. I was going south. I remember exactly where I was. I was in the Richardson area going south on Central Expressway. And all of a sudden I saw the red lights, the brake lights coming on in front of me. I had plenty of room to stop. I hit my brakes and slowed down to a stop. Unfortunately, the driver of the 18-wheeler behind me was not as prepared as I was. And he rammed the back of my truck. It was really a hard hit. A lot of damage done to the truck. I don't remember a lot about what happened after that, but I do remember getting out of my truck for whatever reason and wandering around on Central Expressway. I remember I was dressed in a suit and a tie. It was still raining a little bit. I remember that an ambulance did not come, but a police officer did come, and I remember this police officer asking me if I was okay. And I remember looking down. I didn't have any marks, any blood. I had no injury that I could tell whatsoever. And I assured him, I said, oh, yeah, I'm perfectly fine. We've got some damage to the truck here, but other than that, everything's okay. 12 hours later, I was in severe pain, primarily my neck and upper shoulders. The next day when I went to the doctor and then ultimately to my physical therapist, they both told me exactly the same thing. They said the reason you didn't feel pain at the time is because your body had gone into at least a mild form of shock, and you weren't feeling pain even though your body was hurting. And guess what? Your diagnosis is whiplash, severe whiplash. I have a little bit of trouble with my neck to this day. Well, I thought about that incident as I was working on this particular psalm, and in fact, I've been reading the Psalms in the season of Lent. I hope you've been doing that as well. And I thought, if you read the Psalms, you're going to get a case of whiplash. You just are. We might call it biblical whiplash or spiritual whiplash. But if you read through the Psalms, they are so different in tone and in content. The emotional quality of the Psalms change so radically, abruptly, that if you read through the Psalms, you're going to get whiplash. For instance, there are a lot of Psalms that started out that are like this one started out, Psalms of joy and praise. They're beautiful Psalms. They make us feel better. They're the Lamentations, the Psalms of lament, where the psalmist is expressing tremendous regret and grief over something. They're the kingly Psalms, a handful of kingly Psalms celebrating the kingly virtues of David, we assume. There are some Psalms of comfort, some of the greatest ones and most memorable ones, Psalms of comfort. The 23rd Psalm, the great 23rd Psalm, for instance. Tune in next week. Chris will be preaching on the 23rd Psalm. I've been in the ministry for 48 years. I've never gone to a graveside service, or here in recent years we do interments more than gravesides. I've never done a service at the grave or in the interment, in the columbarium, without reading the 23rd Psalm. What a powerful and comforting word of solace that is. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. And then just to wrap up here, there's a handful of Psalms that some scholars refer to as the cursing Psalms. There's no profanity to be found in them, but the Psalms are Psalms where the writer of the Psalm is so angry that he might as well be cursing. I have a pastor friend. He once told me about a man that came to visit him. He was very, very upset. He came for a counseling session, and he sat in front of my friend's desk, and he said, I'm here because I'm so very, very angry about the betrayal of a friend. And he went in and he told the story in quite a lot of detail about how this man had once been his best friend, how he had been betrayed in egregious ways. It had cost him money, it had cost his reputation, there had been gossip, it had hurt his family. And he said, it's been years now, and I've tried every way I can to find resolution over this. He said, I'm a Christian, I believe in God, I know Jesus said we're supposed to forgive our enemies. But he said, Pastor, I just can't, to tell the honest truth. I hate him. I hate him. And my pastor friend said, well, let's read and see what the psalmist has to say about that. And so he picked up his Bible and he read a portion of the Psalm 109, beginning with verse 7. This is about a psalmist who's extremely angry with someone. And this is what he hopes will happen. When the sentence is passed, let him be found guilty. Let his prayer be found sinful. Let his prayer be found sinful. Let his days be few. Let someone else assume his position. Let his children become orphans. Let his wife turn into a widow. Let his children wander aimlessly, begging, driven out of their ruined homes. Let a creditor seize everything he owns. Let strangers plunder his wealth. Let no one extend faithful love to him. Let no one have mercy on his orphans. Let his descendants be eliminated. Let their names be wiped out in just one generation. Let his father's wrongdoing be remembered before the Lord. Let his mother's sin never be wiped out. Let them be before the Lord always, and let God eliminate the very memory of them in this land. The man turned to my friend the pastor and he said, my God, I don't hate him that much. And so we see that in the Psalms, don't we? The whole range of human emotions. If you read the Psalms, you're going to get whiplash. This psalm is so interesting because the whiplash comes 2/3 of the way through. It starts with a song of joy, and then all of a sudden, the message turns stern. The worship leader turns to the congregation, and he says, let us remember our history. Let us remember our ancestors who were in the wilderness. Let us remember their dramatic failure. Let us remember that they sinned against God, that they failed in their attempt to be trustworthy, to be faithful. They failed in their attempt to be courageous followers of God. And so we recall that history in the wilderness. We don't like wilderness experiences very much, do we? We can look back. I've done this before. I looked back at the story of the Hebrews in the wilderness and I've thought, why did they need to wander 40 years in the wilderness? Why couldn't it have been 40 days or maybe, 40 hours in the wilderness? But if you read the story carefully, I think it becomes clear. Wandering in the wilderness for 40 years was the opportunity that God had to teach them about what it means to be faithful and to trust in God. In my mind, this is the most significant experience that the Hebrews have since that moment in the 12th chapter of Genesis that Abraham and Sarah are asked to go on a journey, the original faith story. Now we find this central experience of the Hebrews and by inheritance of us as Christians as well. They're wandering in the wilderness and they lose their nerve and they lose their faith. Their great failure was that they panicked in the midst of crisis and they lost their trust in God. And so in these two moments when they looked around, they couldn't find water easily, and they turned against Moses, they turned against Aaron, and finally they turned against God. And I'll just tell you, this is kind of a summary of what happened, but basically God said in that moment, this generation, talking about the older Hebrews who should have been the leaders in that moment, this generation will never enter the land that I have promised them. Their bones will dry out and bleach on the land where you now stand. The worship leader is reminding them in this psalm of the tendency to panic in moments of crisis. And so, of course, we also want to remember the central lesson of the journey through the wilderness, and that is how it is that we trust in God. In another passage, we've talked about this a lot at Christ United through these years. Another passage, the people become panicked, they become disturbed because they don't know where the food's going to come from. And so God promises them to give them manna every single day. He says, I promise you, you will have food every single day, but one day at a time. Don't try to store it up or hoard it, because if you do, it will not last. And of course, we know the story. It's almost a comedy of errors in some ways. Some of the people, of course, they got food, they got manna on the first day, but being human, as we all are, they thought, we need to think long term about this. We need to take care of ourselves. We need to protect ourselves. We need to hoard this food. So they get the food and they put it in their backpacks and save it till the next day. But of course, the next day, the food has gone bad. Does that story sound familiar to you in this particular moment of our communal life? We panic, we care only for ourselves, we hoard. The promise of God was good, and the promise of God was enough. God said, if you will turn to me and trust me one day at a time, you will always have enough. The most difficult thing about faith, and yet the most important thing about our practice of faith, is that you can't do it in the future tense. Make no doubt about it. We hope, of course. We think about the restoration of the garden. We think about that 21st chapter of Revelation. That's the hope that fuels us in terms of our faith for today. But faith itself happens only in the present. It happens only today. That's why Jesus said, I encourage people, I say it every single day of my life, I say the Lord's Prayer. Jesus knew what he was saying. He said it with intentionality when he said, give us this day our daily bread. It was a reference to the experience of the Hebrews in the wilderness. The depth of failure as they turned from God into their own resources, and yet the story of faithfulness when we're able to say, we know that even in the midst of crisis, we do not have to panic, because God is with us every single day. God will give us what we need every single day. On Christmas Eve, this past December, I stood right here at the close of the 6:30 service, close of my sermon, and I said, look, it's just human nature. We're wired this way to believe that when things are going well, God is with us and God is blessing us. So when the stores are full and when we are going to work every day and the company or the corporation is doing well and we're getting raises and sales are doing good and the stock market is up, we're just wired to think that God is with us and that God is blessing us. When our children are healthy and safe and secure, when our parents are in good health, our grandparents are in good health, we're just wired to say, thank you, God, I know you're with us, I know you're blessing us. The way the wiring in our brains works is just the opposite when we find ourselves in times of difficulty or trouble or being tested. We seem to think when things are going wrong, when the stock market's down, when the jobs are going away, when the shelves are empty, when the disease is near at hand, we tend to think that God is not only not blessing us, but that God is absent. When in fact, if you read the Bible carefully, the opposite is true. It is God's promise to us that in good times and in bad times, God will be with us. It is God's promise to us that God will be with us not only in the promised land, but that God is with us there in the wilderness as well. It is God's promise to us that God is not just at the destination, but that God is with us on the journey. It is God's promise to us One that we remember when we think about the fact that God gave us life, God sustains us in this life, and will sustain us in the life to come. It is God's promise to us that if we'll fall on our knees and worship and trust God, we will always know God's presence. So in this time, may you remember the God who brought life to you, who breathed life into you and to the ones you love. Remember God who has sustained you in the difficult days of the past as well as the good ones. And remember that this is a God who will sustain you into life and life everlasting whenever that moment comes. Lift up your hearts. Be of good courage. Know that God is with you. Amen.